Welcome to In the News for August the 18th, 2023. I am Brett Burney from appsandlaw.com.
And I'm Jeff Richardson from iPhone JD. Hey, Brett.
Good morning, Jeff. Just want to say thanks again to our friends at SaneBox. They are sponsoring today's episode. You can learn more at sanebox.com/inthenews. And now let's get to the news, Jeff. I thought it was great you started off your post today with something that I guess I've always had on a very far back burner there, but hadn't really considered it. But a couple of people have been talking about it this week. Is there a possibility that Apple could purchase Disney?
Yeah, it seems crazy, doesn't it? And yet there
does?
are some signs and something that people have talked about for a long time. 10 years ago, before Apple even had Apple TV Plus, if somebody told you that Apple was going to be making movies that get Oscars and TV shows that get
Right.
Emmys, you would have
Good
said,
point.
What? What are you talking about?
Ridiculous.
And yet
Right.
here we are, and that's the
Here
world
we
that we
are.
live in. So things definitely change over time for sure. And Disney is having, I mean, not that they're doing fine, but there's a lot of financial issues with Disney. They spent a lot of money to get their Disney Plus service up and running, and they've got a lot of debt to pay that off. And one of their big cash cows, ESPN, is going to be making a lot less money in the future. ESPN makes all of its money because when you subscribe to cable, you have to pay for ESPN, whether you use it or not.
Right.
And so every cable subscriber pays for ESPN. And yet so many people are moving beyond cable companies and cutting the cord and stuff that revenue stream is starting to dry up. So, people are sort of wondering what's Disney going to do in the future. And, there's been some pressure in the company. At the same time, the tech companies out there are buying up content left and right. And, will Amazon purchase, what would they get, the James Bond and stuff like that? And will some of these companies like Paramount and stuff, will they continue to be independent, or will they be purchased? It's a possibility. I still wouldn't say it's probable, but if there was ever a time when it seemed like it made some sense, it makes a heck of a lot more sense today than ever before, although there's a serious number of questions about, Apple is traditionally so focused on just doing a few things, although they do a lot more now than they used to. It would change so much to have Disney under their control too. It's an interesting question, though.
One of the articles you linked to was from Jason Snell, who has been around for a long, long time. He was the editor of the Macworld magazine for a long time. And he was just writing here that the speculation about Apple purchasing Disney was always ridiculous to me. But like you said, Jeff, these are different times. And Disney and Apple are different companies than they were a couple of decades ago. And while he used to roll his eyes at that speculation, he's like, well, it could happen. And we've always known, in fact, we talked about this several times, there has always been a close relationship between Apple and Disney, right? Steve Jobs and Bob Iger and just a lot of the things with Pixar and everything going on. So I guess it couldn't be too far-fetched, but it's fun to speculate, if nothing else. I think is kind of neat.
Yeah, and a lot of these merger stories, lots of times they seem bizarre until they actually happen.
Right.
For years
Right.
and years ago, I mean, I remember, gosh, in the 1980s, one of my favorite companies was Activision, who made the games that I played on my Atari 2600. And Activision Blizzard are still around today, and then Microsoft is going to buy them. And if you had told me in the 80s or even the 90s, Microsoft, that company that makes the stuff you use to do word processing would be purchasing Activision, and be like, what are you talking about? But of course they have purchased many companies over the years, including the folks that made Halo way back when. So things seem bizarre until they're suddenly not bizarre, and then they happen. So that's sense. The thing. That's why you can't say that it will never happen. It is hard to picture Apple CEO Tim Cook wearing Mickey Mouse ears, but then again, never know. Maybe so.
It's only weird until it actually happens. Well, let's jump to this, because you kind of alluded to this about cable and ESPN. And I saw this story a couple of times this past week that, am I getting this right now? We used to say, cut the cable, right? Because cable television, I mean, I remember we were paying $150, $200 a month, maybe even more, several years ago for cable. And like, I was paying for hundreds of stations that we never even watched, Jeff.
Right.
And I remember my wife and I had this conversation, and sure enough, several years ago, we cut the cable, cut the cord, and we started just doing streaming. Now, I did realize maybe about a year and a half ago, it's like, wait a minute, we're paying for Netflix, we're paying for Hulu, we're paying for Disney, we have Amazon Prime through Amazon, and I'm like, wait a minute, like, wait, the math is getting a little crazy here. Like, we're almost to the point where we were paying the same amount just on streaming services that we were paying for cable TV, and it sounds like that balance is actually being realized now by several other people this past week.
Yeah, I mean the article here, I mean the one that you're showing right now is from Ben Lovejoy, but I've seen another other articles that say the same
Right.
thing, that when you look at the mix that most people purchase for streaming video services, and you sort of compare it to what an equivalent package would have been through cable, we've gotten to the point that because the services get a little bit more expensive, Apple TV
Yep.
Plus raised their prices,
They
Hulu and
did.
Disney are raising their prices right now.
Right.
It's gotten to the
HBO
point where it's
Max.
pretty
Right.
even, and I'll tell you this, he may be right for most people. Just to speak anecdotally, for me personally, I looked very seriously at cutting the cord, or in my case, it was cutting the satellite because I pay for DirecTV.
Okay.
I'd looked at it
Okay.
about a year and a half ago, because it just seemed like I heard about so many people like you who cut the cord over the years. I'm thinking, gosh,
Right.
why am I still paying this? And so I did the math. I actually looked at, admittedly, like you say, Brett, there are so many channels that I get through DirecTV that I never watch. I'm like,
Right.
if I could
Right.
just not pay for the XYZ channel, boy, I'd be saving so much money. But it's not
Right.
that simple. As you
Yeah.
know, it's really
Yeah.
not. Things just are part of the bundles. And so when I said, okay, so if we're going to cancel DirecTV, that means we're not getting our local channels anymore, which means I'm going to have to
Yep.
subscribe
That's
to a
true.
service that
That's
provides my
true.
local channels, and I need to use their packages. And of course, I would want to have HBO, or the service formerly known as HBO, whatever they're calling it now, Max. Of course I
Max.
want this, of course I want that. And when I did the math and I put it all together, I'm like, it's basically the same cost. And maybe it was a slight difference, like $10. But the thing that stopped me about a year ago is like, this is current prices. All it's going to take is one of
Yeah.
these streaming services to increase by $2 or $3 a month, which of course
True.
is happening as we speak. And it's going to go the other way. And although I really very rarely turn my DirecTV on, when I sit down at TV, I am mostly watching streaming services through my Apple TV
Right.
device.
Right.
But the reason I'm watching those channels is I'm not paying, because I pay for HBO through DirecTV. That is why it's on my, Apple TV device,
Gotcha.
because I'm
Okay.
paying for XYZ. So I'm still paying for it, even though I'm not necessarily using the DirecTV interface very often. And then every once in a while, I actually do want to jump over to DirecTV. So it's not like I never use it. So I did the math, and it did not make sense for me to cut the cord.
Yeah.
And that was an exercise that before I started to put pen to paper on it, if you had told me, after you do this analysis, Jeff, you're going to decide not to change anything, I would have said, you're crazy. No, I'm
Yeah.
figuring out how much
Yeah.
money I'm going to save.
Right.
But when I did the math, it really wasn't that much. So it's interesting. And so what's going to be the implication of this? Does it mean that people will start staying more with the cable company? What is the future going to be? Are these streaming services going to stay separate? Will some of them start to combine to make things that are more reasonable package, that you get multiple things? But then the next thing you're going to end up back at basically the cable bundle again. It's just that you'll be paying one price to company X.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, and it's changing. It really is.
To underscore that quickly, the main thing that people told us when I would tell them that we cut the cable, or the two things that always comes up, it's like, well, how are you going to get local channels and slash local news? Although I find today that I can usually get as much local news as I need just from other outlets or
That's
online.
an interesting
But
point.
the
Yeah.
but the other thing today that people would say, Jeff, of course, is sports. How are you going to
Right.
be able to
That's the
watch the
big one.
football
Live
games
sports.
and the
Right.
baseball
Right.
games? And we have talked about this over the last couple of years. That's one of the reasons that I stay so interested in seeing some of these sports deals, right? Specifically Apple. The fact that they had, Major League Baseball, and they're starting to bring that on. Now they have Major League Soccer, which obviously a lot of people have been talking about, that I don't know if they're all that excited about it, at least here in the United States. But I'm sure, I mean, that's why I keep asking, like, is there anything happening like with NHL, NFL, the NBA? I mean, the what we consider to be like some of the very, very big markets, because if one of those sports major franchises ink some kind of a deal with a streaming service, because they already have, to some extent, right? It's almost like they've been testing the waters. But if something like that happens, that could, I mean, I feel like a lot of people would be making some additional calculations on that. And
Yeah.
it's just been
And
interesting to kind of see how this has changed over the last few years too.
Yeah. I mean, the big one in the United States, of course, is NFL football. I mean, they are the king
Right.
of ratings, and Apple
Right.
was in
Right.
negotiations with them recently. And at the
Right.
end of the day, NFL decided not to go with them. And so, things have been decided for the next, I don't know if it's the next 5 years or 10 years, whatever that period is. But
Right.
you do tend to wonder what's going to happen the next go around. It's very interesting. And like you said, this ties into the whole Disney stuff, because it's the whole, what are you
Right.
bundling with? What are you owning?
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's the reason why Amazon and Apple have their streaming services, and might be interested in expanding and getting more. I mean, there's one of the rumors is that Disney might want to sell off ESPN. Is it possible that even if Apple doesn't buy Disney,
Right.
it just buys ESPN? Wouldn't that be interesting if ESPN
Hmm.
was, or if it was not
It's
owned
like
by
college
maybe some
football and wow.
extensive partnership with? I mean, there's
Right.
just so many possibilities, and nothing's written in stone. Everything can
Right.
be done.
Right.
Just because it's been done the same way for years and years or decades in some cases doesn't mean we can't have something brand new going forward. So it's exciting, but it's also confusing to try to make the decision of what's best for individual consumers. It's just a lot going on.
One other thing quickly before there's a happy birthday in order, but real quick, you mentioned that you made a link to another. Speaking of streaming, it's just interesting to kind of again see the evolution of this Apple TV Plus. You and I talk about a lot of their shows, but it sounds like they have been filming a Godzilla series, like a TV series of some kind, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like I don't know
Yeah.
how many reincarnations of Godzilla can happen, but anyway, the interesting thing about this that you pointed out today is that it's being filmed partly in 3D, not for like an IMAX theater necessarily, but for Vision Pro. That'll be
Yeah.
interesting to see how this goes.
And Brett, this ties into the exact same story we were just talking about.
Uh
First of
huh.
all, we should say Apple has not admitted this. They haven't said publicly anything about Vision Pro, but
Okay. Okay.
many people, on the internet are saying, that they have, they can confirm that not only do you have the regular cameras on the set, but you also have, the special 3D cameras. And Apple, and again, this goes into the franchise things too. Apple did recently get the rights to do the Godzilla, even though it seems like, oh, Godzilla has been made so many times, but it's another one of these franchises that were out there
Oh
that
yeah.
they have the rights
I'll
to.
watch
And I
it.
think it's going to have Kurt Russell, I think, is going to be in it and stuff like that.
It's what it says. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be good. But when the Vision Pro, we all know it's coming out. It's going to be out at some point early 2024.
Right.
Of
Right.
course, Apple is going to have some interesting content. I mean, that the Apple TV Plus and Vision Pro are a potential marriage made in heaven. And so why not have some of their marquee
Mm-hmm.
shows that have features where maybe it's not the entire show, but parts of the show while you're watching the show, suddenly when
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
when the Godzilla comes out, he'll be like in 3D and almost you can touch him, which is a little scary perhaps. But of course they're going to want to do these things. And this ties back into the sports that we were just talking about, because people have said that one of the reasons why a partner like Apple might be perfect for a
Right.
sports network, whether it was the NFL or ESPN or college sports, which is something that they tried to do until a couple of weeks ago, is that, wouldn't it be interesting if you could actually have a seat that's, the perfect seat on the basketball court, the perfect seat in the football stadium, where you could look around and you can see things, you can see different camera angles,
Right.
things
Right.
that, when you watch TV, it's a very passive experience. You see the camera angles that they show you, but wouldn't it be interesting if you could control the camera angles yourself? If you could say, I want to, be on the camera that's flying over on top, or I want to be in that front row seat, or I want to have the perspective, or I want to be able to look all around me in 3D. These are the sort of, it's a technology issue that a company like Apple could bring to televisions, live sports, that would just completely change the viewing experience. And
Yeah.
when Apple first announced the Vision Pro, what was that, at WDC a couple months ago in
Right.
June,
Uh-huh.
they
Right.
they allowed the this very small number of people that had a chance to try the early
Right.
production units. They were able to watch about a 20-minute
I
video
was thinking
that had all
about
sorts of
this.
things. It had
Yeah.
movies and TV shows and stuff like that, and pictures that people have taken at their kid's birthday. But one very small segment of it was
Uh-huh.
live sports. I think it was soccer, and the people that watched it said, or maybe baseball, one of the two. But the people that watched it came away and said that even though that segment was just like 30 seconds, it was
Right.
the most impressive sports watching experience they've ever had, short of actually being in the stadium. In fact, maybe it's better than the stadium because you don't have the perfect seats. And so if that's just the 30-second version, how cool would it be? So Apple has this
Right.
relationship with major leagues, with American soccer, Major League Soccer. And so you've got to think that at some point in 2024, 2025, maybe people that are not huge soccer fans might become soccer fans because of this ultra realistic totally immersive experience that you can get watching it, having a Vision Pro. And the Vision Pros are not going to be a ton of them sold in the first year, but they will eventually, I'm sure, get more popular. It would be really interesting if 5 years ago, one of the reasons that this whole entertainment, content world has changed is not just because of the things you and I were talking about before, about who owns what and which companies have merged with which companies,
Right.
but also just because the viewing experience can be so different because of something like the Vision Pro. There's just endless possibilities out there. It's really interesting.
When you started talking about the journalists that went to WWDC and they had the opportunity to put on the Vision Pro, I thought you were going to talk about this little clip that all of them discussed where they put it on and they looked at a wall and a dinosaur came out of the
Yeah.
wall,
Mm-hmm.
crashed through the wall. And I'm like, well, that's not that far of a cry from
Watching Godzilla.
Godzilla.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think the Godzilla in 3D made for Vision Pro would want me to go out and buy a Vision Pro, but I got to just think, Jeff, it would definitely get me to an Apple store where I would want to try on a Vision Pro, right? In other words, maybe it's just a kind of a publicity stunt for Vision Pro, right? It's like you can go and watch, 30 seconds or a minute of the movie or the trailer even, something like that. I think that'd be cool. I would do that probably several times over. Sir, can you please leave the Apple store now? You've been here for 3 days.
Exactly.
Okay, happy birthday is in order for something that is, I would say, is pretty near and dear to our hearts, Jeff.
Oh,
This is
yes.
part of our journey of technology over the last, 25 years, because the iMac this past week turned 25. And I have heard some of our favorite journalists and technology thought leaders, including Jason Snell, talk about this over this past week. And Jason wrote, I thought, an excellent article for The Verge, How the iMac Saved Apple. We really take this for granted today, Jeff, and what we're talking about. But a few other times we've gone down history lane and we've talked about how Apple was nowhere near the same company that it is today. And there are some pretty important turning points in the history of Apple, and the iMac 25 years ago was definitely one of those turning points.
Yeah. I mean, Apple is now the number one company in the world in terms of revenue and profit and everything else. But those of us that have been watching the company for a long time remember the 90s. The 90s were dark days for Apple. I mean, they were
Yeah.
on the brink of bankruptcy. They were not making any money. People were talking about a company like Sun, speaking of mergers, buying
Oh my
Apple.
goodness,
And,
yeah.
the Michael Dell of Dell, famously quipped that somebody should just buy Apple and sell it off for parts.
Right.
Which was obviously, something that a competitor would say, but there was also some thought, Apple was at a horrible place. And when Steve Jobs came back into the company, because the
Right.
company decided to acquire Next,
97.
thank goodness they
Right.
did, that,
Right.
Steve looked around and said, what do we have here? What can we do? And, he saw a lot of confusion. He saw that Apple was making way too many products. There was millions of different Macs with different numbers. They all looked the same. They were boring. But he found some good stuff. I mean, he found Johnny Ive for one thing.
Yep,
He found some
exactly.
ideas for these computers. And one of the things that he saw was sort of this idea of something like an iMac, which was very true to the original Mac idea. The first Mac that came out in
Right.
1984
Right.
was this
Right.
all-in-one device that seemed personal. You could carry it around. Not that it wasn't heavy, but it did have a handle, which meant that it
have a
was
handle.
okay to touch it. It's not this computer thing that you have
Yep.
to be worried about getting close to it. Of course, now we
Right.
have the most personal devices ever with the iPhone and the Apple
Exactly.
Watch and everything
Yep.
else. But the iMac was transformative. And people think about the translucent blue color of the original model. And now
Diamond
people
blue.
sort of tisk and say, oh, well, that's just, that's the way it looks. That's not, important. But Apple has always married
It was
how
big.
something looks and how
Yeah.
something works.
Yeah.
So many things you could say about the iMac. USB was around at the time, but not many people were using it. And
Mm-mm.
Apple made the bold decision that we're going to be all USB, which caused
Right.
all these third-party manufacturers to make USB versions. And it definitely made USB a lot more popular a lot sooner than ever before. It did not have a floppy disk drive because Apple decided that was part of the past. It had the
That
CD-ROM
was
drive. There's so much
big.
to say.
That was big.
I didn't purchase that first iMac, but I got one of the next models, the iMac DV.
Right.
And from that point in the
Oh,
90s, all
Yeah.
the way through to this year, because I bought a Mac Mini earlier this year, mainly because Apple is not selling an iMac 27-inch, and I didn't want to get the smaller iMac. But for almost 25 years, my home computer was an iMac of one form or another, and they've changed over the years, and they've had some interesting designs. But this was a big computer. It's less important today when most people have a laptop. People like me with desktop
Sure.
computers are the minority now. But it really saved the company. And and one more thing I'll say is that the angle that I mentioned today is, one of the things iMac did, sort of silly, but it brought the word I to Apple, which
And
although
you
Apple
wrote about
doesn't use it
this. Yeah.
anymore, I wrote about this back in 2009 that, why did they come up with this idea of the I? And then once you had an iMac, the same I was used in a whole bunch of other devices, including the iPod, and then of course now the iPhone. And
Yeah.
nowadays, Apple uses a different branding technology where they like to say, whatever the product is, use a generic term for it, and then Apple. So Apple
Right.
TV or Apple Watch and these
Watch.
other
Yep.
things. But for many, many years, it was I, and the iPhone itself is such an iconic name that I don't think they'd ever change the name of it to the Apple phone. It's going to be called the iPhone forever because everybody knows the
Yeah.
iPhone.
Yeah.
So,
That's
but
a
the
good point.
iPhone would not have been called the iPhone if the iMac had not been called the iMac. So just so many things that have changed for the company back in 1998. So happy
I remember
25
your
years.
post. This is from January 2009. Why the I and iPhone? And I was just looking back here. I had forgotten even things as iPhoto. I still call it iPhoto, even though
Mm-hmm.
formally, officially, it's just Photos, the Photos app, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they even had iChat. We had the
Mm-hmm.
iLife software. We had iWork. We had the
Mm-hmm.
iWeb. I mean, it wasn't just like the actual products, the physical products. It was also
Services too.
yeah,
Yeah.
some of the software and stuff on that. Just real quick to underscore the idea of the universal serial bus. Just like you said, it was around. USB was around, but it wasn't like you can go down to Circuit City at the time and get, I mean, there would be a couple of USB mice, but I just remember even Jason was talking about the next couple of months after the iMac came out, every manufacturer was scrambling to come up with a USB interface or a device because it was something that wasn't. We were using SCSI and parallel ports. I remember, and all the other kind of things. And then the other thing quickly that you mentioned, the iMac did not come with a floppy drive. And obviously today we're like, well, of course it didn't. But back then that was huge.
Oh
We
yeah.
booted our computers that way. And I also remember then it wasn't the first iMac a sliding CD tray, right? Because at that
Mm-hmm.
time it was like CD, but of course CDs at the time were only readable, they weren't writable. So didn't your iMac DV, wasn't that DV, wasn't that a nod to like you were able to write? Like, didn't you have the ability to do DVD ROMs then at that point, or you could even
Correct.
read or write, or maybe just read on that? I mean, those were
Yeah,
those were big things then.
it was called the DV because the idea is it was the digital video that you were using your iMac for. The original iMac,
Okay,
the
okay,
focus was on
gotcha.
using the internet. And the idea is you don't need floppy drives because your files are going to be on the internet. And of course, the
Right,
internet was such in its infancy in the 1990s compared to today, that it was still very revolutionary to say that. But the reality is that people were moving away from floppy disks. And although a lot of people would get an external floppy drive as an accessory for their iMac just to sort of, get through those first few years, it wasn't long before people stopped using floppy disks completely. And nowadays we
correct,
look back and say,
correct.
haha, floppy disks. But it was transformative. I mean, USB as a
Yeah,
standard, we're still using USB today. I know that USB-C is the hot new thing, but people
right.
still
We
use
still
USB
use
ports.
A.
And you can
Right.
still take like something that you plugged into that first iMac in 1998 through USB, whether it's a floppy drive or a mouse, you could still use those peripherals today, 25 years later, which is pretty amazing, staying power for, I mean, SCSI
Yes.
is long gone. It did not last that long. Other
Nope.
technologies did not last. So, USB was pretty good for Apple to pick those things at the time. And then on the drive, there's a funny story that Steve Jobs rather, did not want to have the tray come out the front of the iMac because
Right.
he wanted it to just to be a clean slot. But the problem was nobody was making one that you could use in quantity for the iMac. And so he finally relented. But then they did in the next generation
The
have
next
one that
one.
didn't actually come out. It was just a slot that you slid the CD in, which is what the one that I owned. But like you said, you could use DVDs and stuff like that with it. And that was, very, moving the industry forward and everything else. So,
Right.
you know, God bless the iMac. It changed so much, but it really was part of saving Apple, and thank goodness for that, because that was the first thing that we needed to do was save Apple in the 90s,
Right.
and then they could focus on making good products, introducing things like Wi-Fi, which is sort of a big
Right.
deal nowadays, and then the iPod, and then the iPhone, and then the iPad, and et cetera, et cetera, and maybe next the Vision Pro.
In Jason's story here, just if you want to go back and see an Apple ad, television ad from 1998, this was pretty amazing, to underscore your point about being online, because the iMac ad say, hey, you get the iMac, and there's three steps to get online, right? Plug the power in, and then they have, it wasn't Wi-Fi, but they actually have the phone line, to plug in for the modem, and then the
Right.
ad goes, step three. Well, there is no step three. That's it. Like, that's all you had to do. One thing quickly I do want to say on the downside, the iMac, for all of its glory, the one thing that people did not like about it was the round mouse. Do you remember
Oh,
that,
that was
Rod?
a
Did you
horrible
have
idea.
that? Yeah.
I did, because that's what came with it. When Steve Jobs
Right.
introduced it, he said it's the best mouse ever. No, it was the
No,
worst mouse
it
ever.
was
It
it was
looked it
bad.
looked cool, but you had
Right.
no idea what direction was facing up. It was horrible, and thank goodness Apple finally replaced that. But it did look interesting. That was an example. If people are going to use an example of something that looks good, form over
Right.
function, that is, I think, perhaps the best example in
It's
the history of Apple as a company. It was the worst thing that was done because it looked interesting, but it was non-functional. There's a rumor that I've heard many, many, many times over the years, and I've heard it stated again this week, that the people inside of Apple who hated that round mouse, whenever they
right.
would have a meeting with Steve Jobs, they would take the computer that Steve was going to be working at, and they would take that round mouse and they would turn it about 15 degrees, so that when Steve first touched the mouse and moved up, the cursor would actually move a little to the side, and they just wanted to annoy him a little bit, so that he would finally give thumbs up to their plans to have the next mouse not be round. So I always thought that was a fun story. That ad, by the way, there is no step three. You can't
Yeah.
mention that ad without saying Jeff Goldblum, because the actor Jeff Goldblum did the voiceover for that,
Oh
and his very
yeah.
distinctive voice, I think it was
It's
part
good.
of the ad. Apple has had times over the years where they've used very distinctive voices for their very distinctive and memorable ads, and he did a great job with that one.
So what, about 15, 20 years after the iMac came the iPad, maybe not quite, but then 25 years later, it's been a long time. We have apps for the iPad. So we're changing gears just a little bit, but I want you to talk quickly about a review that you wrote this past week on the Goodnotes app. So Goodnotes has been around for the iPad for a long time. This is your preferred note-taking app on the iPad. I like it as well, although I usually tend to go to Notability. So I find a lot of people are in either the camp of Goodnotes or Notability. They're very similar in what they can do. It really comes down, I think, to a personal preference in the way that it looks. But I was very excited to read your review this past week of Goodnotes 6. Take handwritten notes on your iPad.
Yeah, I've talked about Goodnotes in the past on the podcast. I love it. It's I
Yeah.
just I love being able to take handwritten notes and have them all right there on my iPad, so that if I need to go back and find notes from 6 months ago, they're just right there. And it's just so convenient. The Apple Pencil works so great. Goodnotes is great. I've been using it for, I don't know, a decade. The new version that came out this week has got some interesting new features that make it just some new gestures that make it a little bit faster to use the app. Like, for example, if you want to
Okay.
select something, instead of actually changing to the lasso tool to
Right.
select and then move something from one part of the page to the other, now you can just draw a circle and then hold down on the circle with your pen, and it changes the circle into a lasso selection.
Oh,
I mean, it's a little, that's a little geeky little thing, but it does save you some steps.
save
And
some
oftentimes
seconds.
when I'm taking notes, seconds matter, because someone else is speaking and I'm taking notes, and you want to write things as fast as possible. So that's great. But the thing that struck me as most interesting about Goodnotes is, like so much other technology that we're talking about nowadays, Brett, artificial intelligence is, all the rage now. And they used AI in Goodnotes 6 to automatically be looking at your notes
Oh,
as you're typing it,
okay.
to reading it, to try to mimic your handwriting. So the end result is, we all know how, if you're typing in a word processor, Microsoft Word, and if you misspell a word, it will put little dots, red dots
Right.
underneath it, so that you can see that you
Autocorrect.
have a misspelling of autocorrect, and you can go do it. But I never would have thought that live autocorrect would work on and handwriting. And yet with Goodnotes 6, it does. So as I am taking handwritten notes, and sometimes my handwriting is pretty bad, but Goodnotes does an amazing job of reading the handwriting. And if I
It
misspell
does. Yeah.
something, it'll put the little dots under it. And again, unlike a written thing in a word processor where I'm going to provide it to a court or to somebody else and I want all the words spelled correctly, I don't always care if my words are spelled correctly in my notes. Sometimes I use silly abbreviations just because they are my notes. But then again, sometimes I do want them corrected. And what's funny is that you can just tap on the word just like you would in a word processor like Microsoft Word, and it will give you, corrections. And if you tap one, it will put it in handwriting, and Goodnotes attempts to mimic your own handwriting. It's not perfect, but it looks pretty close. I mean, it looks like handwriting, and it's just sort of funny that they're adding something that they're doing using handwriting that looks somewhat like my own handwriting. So it's a really interesting feature. And it can also has an autocomplete too, that like if you start to write a word, it can try to offer to autocomplete for you and stuff like that. It's just the first generation of using AI in this. But in my mind, handwriting and autocorrect and spell checking were like two different worlds, and yet here we are, and they're starting to come together. So this is the first version of Goodnotes 6. Who knows what they'll be doing in 6.5 and 7 and everything else, but it's really interesting.
I was just looking, the first time you reviewed Goodnotes on your blog, Jeff, was 2012. And the first thing that strikes me is just the difference of the icon. That looks like a little, looks like a Bondi blue iMac there.
It does,
in 2012. And now today they've got this much cleaner logo, but I think they've added this little smile. I don't remember that smile being in their logo.
That part's brand new.
Yeah. That's interesting. Good stuff. Another link from John Gruber at Daring Fireball. I had to read this twice at least, Jeff, to kind of understand this, but really interesting. John was talking about pinned links in Apple Messages. Really, really neat. It works. I think I understood it on the iPhone, but he was actually talking about it on the Mac OS here. But either way, really kind of a cool, neat little tip.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea would be, let's say that you and I are having a conversation with each other in the Messages app. We're chatting to each other. And then you say, hey, Jeff, the next time that you are up in Ohio, you got to go to this museum or whatever. And you send me a link to the website. Okay. So I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to be in Ohio anytime soon, but I'm going to want to find that link again. And 6 weeks from now, of course, that link, that message between the two of us will be so far up our stream of messages that it would take forever to find it.
Right.
And so the idea is, if you just hold down on the link that's in Messages that you sent me, a little pop-up menu will come up, and one of the options is to pin it. And then in the future, when I'm looking at my chat with you, if I just tap right underneath your name, you'll go to a page, and one of the things that page showed is whatever I have chosen to pin from you. So maybe, and right now I think it's just for links, but maybe it's a link that you gave me today, and a link that you gave me 6 weeks ago, and a link that you gave me 4 months ago. But whichever ones I thought I want to, when I think of Brett, I'm going to think of this link that he sent me. I can just pin them. It's an interesting feature that I had zero idea was even out there. And like you, when John Gruber first described it, it took me a second. Like, what are you, wait, what? What are you talking about? But then once I tried it out a few times, I'm like, wow, this actually could make some sense. So it's a great tip. And in fact, I'm going to have a related tip when we get to our tips of the week today, but it's really interesting.
Okay, we'll come back around to that. In the meantime, let's do the Where You At segment. Where you at? You got some good stuff this as always. I'm almost looking forward to this segment every week now. I love it. Hidden AirTag comes to the rescue for woman in the Netherlands after a thief nabs her bicycle. I think she was able to get it back on this one. Is that right?
Yeah. So here's the, sometimes we see a theme in different articles, and of the two links today, here is the theme. The theme is thieves are getting smarter, and so you need to hide your AirTags. So this woman in the Netherlands, bikes are super popular in the Netherlands, and she hid a AirTag on her bicycle, and so when it was stolen, she was able to go to the police. They found the bike, they recovered it, but she had it in sort of a hidden location. And I know that there are companies that sell all sorts of different ways that you can put an AirTag on your bicycle. And it's hidden, maybe it's hidden behind the reflector or something else. And that seems to be the theme, that if you want to find your stolen bike, don't put your AirTag somewhere obvious. Put it somewhere that the thief might not see it. And remember, AirTags will make noise to let people know. So
I
they may
know.
they may find out about it anyway. But again, you've got your best chance if you hide it. So that's the success story over in the Netherlands. And then if you
Right.
switch to the other story up in Vancouver, somebody had her car stolen, and she's like, fear not, I put an AirTag in my car. And so she follows
I
the
got this.
AirTag all the way to a winery, only to discover it's not her car because the thief took the AirTag. It looks like she must have had some sort of magnet thing to attach to her car. He took it out of the
Right.
car and he put it on to one of these public share cars that you have, these Evo car sharing
Right.
services.
Evo
And
car.
so
Yeah.
she was not following her car; she was following a different car. And it almost seems like part of a movie plot or something. You think you found the thief, and then you pull the mask off, and oh no, the thief fooled me. So
Right.
the bad
Right.
guys know about AirTags, and so if you're going to use one, just keep in mind that you put it in a place that's
Yeah.
not obvious, and keep in mind that even when you do that, it's going to beep from time to time, so the thief may well hear it. I've heard some people talk about putting two AirTags in a vehicle or a device, because that way
Oh
if the
my
thief
goodness.
finds it, they'll just find one, but maybe they won't realize there's a second one there. But
Right.
anyway, just interesting.
And can I just ask, because I'm trying to figure this out, like if the thief has an iPhone, is there a notification that would come on their iPhone, Jeff, that would
Yes.
say, hey, there looks like there's an AirPods that's in your vicinity, kind of a thing? Okay,
Hmm.
so it is,
And the reason
because
it's
I've
there
gotten
is
that,
for
I've seen that a
yeah.
couple of times now, and I'm just wondering, maybe the thief could hear it because every once in a while it'll beep, but also if they have an iPhone, they may know that, okay, this there's actually an AirTag here, and they can either try to get it out, or maybe they'll just go to the next car that doesn't have one, I guess.
Yeah, and it's there for stalking purposes, because the idea is we talk about,
Right,
oh,
right.
this is my car, I should be able to hide an AirTag in it. But if it's your ex-girlfriend or your ex-boyfriend's car and you want to stalk them, you could try to hide an AirTag on their vehicle, and then they're being followed. And that, of course, is not what you want. And so Apple, with that in mind, will if you own an iPhone, it will, and after the AirTag has been with you for a certain period of time, and Apple doesn't tell you what that period of time is, they purposely keep it secret. I've heard it could be as few as a couple of hours, and it couldn't be up to 2 days, but somewhere between
Okay,
six
okay.
hours and 48 hours, it will give you an alert on your iPhone that says, hey, there's an AirTag that you don't own that has been the same place that you are for the past,
Right,
2
right,
days. So
right.
do you know that this AirTag is
Okay,
following you around? And maybe it's fine that you do know it. For example, when my wife takes my luggage to go to a trip up to New York, it's my AirTag following her up to New York,
right.
and that's fine. She says, okay, I know about that. That's okay.
Sure, right.
But then again, maybe it's not. But if you don't have an iPhone, because that's a possibility as well, the device will also beep every once in a while, just to sort of alert anyone out there that it is away from home, so to speak. It's not with the person that owns the AirTag. So it's an interesting device. And although this is the way that Apple does it, you and I reported a couple weeks ago, months ago, I forget now, that Apple's trying to come up with an open standard that everybody in the business would
Right.
use, so that iPhone and Android would all sort of work the same way, so
Correct,
that
right.
to protect against stalking, while also so that's why AirTags are not perfect for finding recovered things. The best stories are always like finding lost luggage, where it's not like with the thief or anything like that, but it can be
Right.
used for finding stolen items
Well,
too.
one more quick story I found because of that. I think last week we talked about a mother flying to find her daughter's lacrosse equipment.
Right.
I saw this story this past week that apparently I did not know that this was a thing. There are foot archers. This young lady uses her feet as an archery. Well, she
Hmm.
had very specialized equipment for that, as you can
Sure.
imagine, since
Yeah.
I wouldn't know about foot archery that much. But apparently, Southwest lost her luggage. But thanks to her AirTag that was in that equipment bag and some fans that she reached out to, they were able to recover that equipment. So just like, I don't know, it seems like a sports theme going through for AirTags equipment on there as well. So that's good. All right. Let's talk quickly about the insanity of not AirTags and finding stuff, but the insanity of your inbox. We are grateful that SaneBox has been working with us over these last couple of weeks as a fantastic sponsor. And I got to tell you, Jeff, I wasn't a huge SaneBox user before, but the more I'm using it, I am just so thankful for the different features that it offers. And one that I'm going to highlight this week is something that's called the Daily Digest. So I've known that some of these other services were available, and I've talked with folks that have used them. And there is almost like that learning curve / period there, where it's like, okay, I'm going to let SaneBox look at my email, which has been great because they have successfully filtered out things that I don't want to delete, and I want to still see like a newsletter, for example, or maybe an announcement from somewhere, but I don't want those messages to necessarily be at the top of my inbox because I want to be able to get access to the emails that I need to reply to or something similar to that. But as I'm going through this, one of the things that that SaneBox will do is say, hey, there's a few messages that we're pretty confident about, but you might just want to look, like, just verify for us. I almost think of it as like if I had a personal assistant, Jeff, that they would say, hey, we've taken care of filtering all of these emails for you. Don't worry about any of these emails unless you want to go and look at it. But, there's a handful here that we just want you just take a peek at and make sure that you don't want to see them, and then we can train, we know for going forward. And that's exactly what the SaneBox Daily Digest has been doing for me. I got to tell you, the first few days when I started SaneBox, I would look at the Daily Digest almost religiously because I'm like, okay, is this doing what I think it's doing? Am I trusting it? Is it filtering out the messages? And sure enough, it did. There may have been one or two that I said, yeah, I'm glad you put that in my inbox, but I would actually prefer that one to go into the newsletters, the Sane News folder, because I can look at that later. And so the more I've used SaneBox, the less and less I feel like I've had to go to the Daily Digest, but they will still send me a Daily Digest. And sometimes now it's maybe just 4 messages, Jeff. And they're like, hey, we've taken care of this for you, but you might just want to look at it. It's a web page, a special web page that opens up immediately when you click into the link. And I can just say, yes, this is all, I confirm all of this. You did the right thing. You moved everything, these messages to the Sane News. Or if there's one that I'm like, I'd like for this one instead to hit my inbox. So just make that change for it real quick. And immediately it's just a couple of clicks and it's been trained now and it works. So anyway, that's the Daily Digest. I almost feel like that it's being trained on the back end anyway. And because I can move things in my Apple Mail, for example, or, in my email on my phone, I can move it into those different SaneBox folders. So it's really training on the back end anyway. But the Daily Digest, at least initially here, has given me a little bit more confidence that, okay, yeah, I can look at these, just verify and confirm that everything's working the right way. So thank you, SaneBox, for the Daily Digest, because it's great. Although I got to tell you, I feel like I'm going to use it less and less. Like I've gotten that confidence level now, Jeff, that it's like, you know what? You're doing a great job. Keep on going. That's my little tip for today from SaneBox.
I've been using SaneBox for like a year now, and I had Daily Digest on for maybe about a month, and it was great to sort of see what was going on. And then I was like, you know what? You're doing great. You don't have to bother me. But I will tell you one cool thing about the Daily Digest. This just shows that they pay attention to the details. Let's just say you get a Daily Digest on Tuesday, and you don't look at it on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, you would get another Daily Digest. So does that mean that you have 2 Daily Digests? No. They're smart enough that they will go back and delete the one from Tuesday and then make the Wednesday one include the last 2 days. So by the time you just get one, and no matter when you last looked at it, and it's got everything that you need since the last time you looked. I'm like, what a smart little feature. Although I now have the Daily Digest feature turned on, one of the features that I have turned off, rather, one of the features I have turned on now is called the Sane No Replies folder. And what this does is, it's, again, SaneBox doesn't look at the content of your message, but if you send a message to a person and from the header and stuff, it seems like this might be something that you might want to respond to. Like, for example, if you send me an email and I reply to it, it's not going to be triggered. But if I initiate the email to you, it says, this might be something that you want to reply, that I wanted to get a reply from Brett, and yet I never did. So what it'll do is it'll take a copy of that message and it'll put it in a folder called Sane No Replies. And so every once in a while, I can look at the folder and it'll just have all these messages in it. And some of those messages are like, well, I didn't expect anyone to reply to that folder. I was just sending an email to Brett saying, have a great day. So no reply necessary. But I might see 1 or 2 of those and I'm like, oh my goodness, I sent that email like 4 days ago. And I haven't gotten a reply to it. That's important. Like, I need to follow up on that. And so that's what the Sane No Replies folder does. It just keeps a list of them. And again, you don't have to check it all the time. but once a week or twice a week, just take a look. And many of them you don't need replies, that's fine, but it will save your bacon. And again, it's like the analogy that you used before, Brett, of like having a personal assistant. It's a little personal assistant
Right,
just tapping on your
exactly.
folder, excuse me, did you want to get a reply from Mike, because he never actually did reply to you? And you're like, oh,
Right.
thank you for reminding me, I need to follow up with Mike. So great little feature. And SaneBox has tons of these features, and you decide which one you want to turn on and turn off. So again, thank you again to SaneBox for
Although
sponsoring. And
I got to point this out real quick, Jeff. It looks like the Sane No Replies is actually included with all the SaneBox plans.
cool,
So
there you
you
go.
get that, by the way, because I know we haven't talked too much about the pricing aspects on here, but exactly what you described, that depending on the actual pricing plan that you want to purchase, you can pick which features are going to be most important to you. But that
Mhm.
Sane No Replies sounds like it's in all of them. And by the way, whichever plan that you choose, if you go to sanebox.com/in the news, first of all, you get a 14-day trial. So you can try this out and you can look at that daily digest for those 14 days and just make sure it's working for you. And then in addition to that, if you go to sanebox.com/in the news, you get a $25 credit toward whatever subscription level that you want to try out with SaneBox. So we'll have that post, that link in the list. In the show notes, of course, sanebox.com/in the news, just all one word there, and you can get a little more information about it. We thank SaneBox for working with us on sponsoring the In the News podcast. Thank you, SaneBox. In the know. Let's go through a
In the
couple of tips
know.
quickly. I'm gonna cheat on mine just a little bit, Jeff. I admit, because it's something we talked about, I think at least maybe a couple of weeks ago. But it is saving camera settings on the iPhone. So yesterday I took my son, who's very big into like World War II memorabilia, tanks and everything. I had no idea that apparently in Conneaut, Ohio, which is in the upper northeastern section of Ohio, on Lake Erie, has a eerily similar beach to the Normandy beach. And so
Huh.
yesterday we went up to a D-Day reenactment, and I had no idea that there were people that got heavily into this, Jeff, but it was absolutely fascinating. So there was like the German camp and the American camp and the British camp and the French Revolution Maquis camps. It was great. They had full on rifles, pistols. We had Sherman tanks on the beach. We had a plane that was like flying over. There were like explosions happening on the beach. There were bunkers. There were machine guns and rifles. It was incredible just to kind of see, even though this was a much smaller scale than obviously the D-Day invasion, but all of these years later, I mean, and some of these equipment is like 85 years old. Okay, anyway, that was interesting enough. So thank you, D-Day, Ohio. But I was obviously taking a lot of pictures and video on the phone. Well, we talked about this last time. I hate it every time that when I opened up my camera app, Jeff, that I would have to say, okay, do I want to take a video, or do I want to take a photo, or do I want to take a portrait mode? And then, right above the little button, the camera button, you have to swipe back and forth to select which mode that you want. And by the time that I finally got on the actual mode, because sometimes you swipe too far, or you don't go to the right one, the moment is lost sometimes, and it just would frustrate me. Well, you pointed this out a few weeks ago, that if you go into your settings and go to camera, there is a little option there called preserve settings, and there's actually several of them on there. The only two that I really do, though, is are at the very top. In preserve settings, it's the camera mode. So what this means is that if I open the camera app and I take a picture, put it back in my pocket, the iPhone locks. Once I turn the iPhone on again and go to camera mode, guess what mode it's in? It's in camera mode. Or if I did a video at the last, it would be back in video mode. It was just very helpful to be able to jump back into that. The other preserve setting that I do is at the very bottom. It's called live photo. Now, the only reason I do this is because I don't like the live photos very much, or I just don't do them because I feel like it takes a little bit more room unnecessarily. Like if I want a photo, I just want a photo. But I turn on preserve the live photo setting. So in other words, if I turn live photo off, that means the next time I open my camera app, the live photo is off. What I find many times is that people don't have that toggled on. And so every time they open their camera, the live photo is on. And so when people send me pictures, it usually is a live photo, which is okay. But I'm like, I don't really need the live photo. I just want like a static picture on there. So anyway, there's several other settings that you can preserve settings in there, but this is settings, camera, preserve settings. And I got to tell you, yesterday it saved me quite a bit of frustration because if I took a video, turned it off, and came back to it, it was back in video mode. And it was just really neat to save, those 5 nanoseconds on there, but it was good.
Yeah, that's an absolute fabulous tip. Fantastic. I use it all the time. It makes a huge difference. My tip today is sort of a follow-up on what we were talking about, the post from John Gruber, where he talked about pinning a link in messages.
Oh,
And that's
yes.
great if you remember to pin the link. But my tip today is much broader, which is that
Okay.
if you have people that you have messages back and forth with, they're going to send you pictures over time. They're going to send you, sharing notes. They're going to send you all sorts of things, a location, here's the location of the store that we're going to meet up. They may send you documents. And then later on, you might want to go find those items. The way that you can do so very quickly is, here's the way that you probably are going to do it. You open up your messages and you just
Right.
start swiping and swiping and swiping
Yeah.
and swiping until you finally
Guilty.
found the picture. And because it was so many months ago, you got to swipe so far, it drives you crazy. Don't do that. There's a much better
Okay.
way. What you do
Yes.
instead is open up your conversation, like I opened up my conversation with you, Brett, and at the very
Yep.
top of the screen, it's got your name. And if I
Yes.
tap right under your name or right on your name, on the iPhone, it's right under, on the iPad, it's right on, you'll then go to a second screen. Now, this is the screen that we were talking about before that, as John Gruber pointed out,
Oh,
has pinned conversations. But
right.
just
Right.
below pinned, or if you've never pinned anything, then just, if you just scroll down a little bit,
Yeah.
you will
I don't have.
see collaboration, which is any shared notes. So if you and I had shared something in the Notes app, it would be there. You will see photos. So it's any photos that I've shared with you and that you've shared with me.
Yeah.
And this is great because you can then, it'll show you like the
That.
first, you have it in front of you, maybe like the first 9 of them. But if
I
you do
do.
see all, you'll see them all. And so that way, even if there was a photo that I have this vague memory that you sent me
Ooh.
like 2 years ago, I could go back and I could find that photo without having to scroll through 2 years of messages, which would take me, almost 2 years to do. So photos, it'll have all the links that we've shared with each other, all the documents. Like if you sent me
Look
a
at
PDF
that.
file, and so it's a great way to get to just those. It reminds me of in the Mail app, there's a mode
Right.
that you can like only look at emails that have attachments on it, which makes it finder because faster if you know you're looking for an attachment on an email. Don't even show me the ones that don't have attachments because I know I don't want to see those.
Right.
But
Right.
this
Right.
is really better. So this is a great tip for anybody. I mean, really anyone that uses
That's
messages, which
really
is just about
cool.
all of them. You vaguely remember that you sent something to someone else or they sent it to you. This
Right.
is the way to find those attachments from the conversation.
This is so cool because especially even with my wife, there's like links she'll send me for like things like, hey, can you pick this up please, or like purchase this one on Amazon with whatever discount that you have or so. And sure enough, I'm swiping back and forth on there, and I guess I knew that this screen was there. It's almost like I call it an info screen, Jeff, but I
Mhm.
guess I just didn't scroll down long enough
You have to
to
scroll
I can
down. Yeah.
see all the links or see all the photos that we've shared. And that's a great like clearinghouse, one-stop location that I can grab all that stuff. That is fantastic. I like that. Now there's more people texting me, so that's that's good. I like it. All right, good stuff. I know we went a little bit long today, but man, only because there's so many good things to talk about. Happy birthday, iMac. Thanks for all the memories. It's been great. And we also thank you, SaneBox, for sponsoring today. Go to sanebox.com/in the news to get some more information. Jeff, always great talking with you, and we'll talk with you next week.
Thanks, Brett. Bye bye, everybody.